Great, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be here at the U.S. Center, and as you said, focusing on energy efficiency and demand response. My coalition, the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, is made up of companies and trade associations in the energy efficiency, renewable energy, and natural gas sectors. We think energy efficiency working together with renewables and natural gas is a portfolio that can meet our energy needs in an affordable and reliable way, while of course getting significant climate change and adaptation benefits. We are here today to explore in a deeper dive energy efficiency and demand response. Before we get into some questions about demand response and energy efficiency, I wanted to offer each one of the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, their company or organization, and talk a little bit about how you're involved in the energy efficiency and demand response sectors. Clay Nessler, can we start with you, please?
Thanks, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clay Nessler, responsible for energy and sustainability for the building efficiency business at Johnson Controls. We're 130 years, almost now, company based in the United States, operations in 150 countries, primary businesses in building efficiency, HVAC equipment, controls, vehicle efficiency, battery systems for starting your vehicle, as well as advanced battery systems to improve the fuel efficiency of your vehicles, and our newest business line, which is distributed energy storage, taking our advanced battery technology and applying it to for energy storage applications in buildings and on the grid. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the energy services and solutions business as a vehicle for financing and installing all the great technologies that my co-panelists are going to talk about.
Thank you. Once again, I'm Dan Delury, and as you heard in my introduction, I'm the chair of the Demand Response and Smart Grid Coalition. Now, many of you out there may not recognize either of those terms, demand response or smart grid, and we'll be talking about that today. But think of it as a group of companies that are both large and small, some that you would obviously have heard of, but some small startup companies coming out of Silicon Valley and other places that are developing new technologies and services that go into the electricity grid, where not a lot has been done over the decades, and trying to modernize that grid and to make it smarter, and in doing so, make it more efficient. And when the grid is more efficient, you can wring kilowatt-hour savings and the associated emissions with that. There's also, hopefully we'll get to talk about, although it's not the main theme here, it makes the grid more reliable and resilient as well.
Hello, my name is Roger Platt. I'm the president of the U.S. Green Building Council. As noted before, we're best known for having created and administering the LEED rating system, a system that recognizes buildings of very high performance. I am going to try to add to the discussion the human element. How do increased and more sophisticated understandings of behavioral economics and human behavior intersect with the technologies people are talking about to make sure that buildings are really performing at their highest levels? I want to just give you just briefly, just so you understand where we're coming from, a couple more minutes about my organization. We have about 80,000 LEED projects around the world in 150 countries, 2 million square feet a day of space that we certify. So we're very much about a giant demonstration project for the new green economy, and also very much about sending exactly the kind of price signal that the folks here at the COP often falter in their efforts to send, a price signal that green is both environmentally responsible but also economically attractive.
Thank you. And I'm Scott Peterson. I'm at Honeywell and the European Business Development Director for our Smart Grid Solutions business. And I bring a European flavor here, even though there's a Kiwi accent here. I have lived in the UK for over 20 years now. So I'm part of Honeywell Building Solutions. That's a $4 billion global business, part of Honeywell, $40 billion multi-technology company. And I focus very much around our demand response solutions as part of Smart Grid. And addressing the issues that we're increasingly finding, especially from a utilities perspective, in the way we manage our energy and specific electricity systems. And I'll bring you some insights around some of the new challenges that are happening around the world, but specifically in Europe. And being part of Honeywell Building Solutions, it is all about buildings, and that's going to be a flavor of what we talk about today. And just some background to that, if we look at the urbanization rates that are happening in our cities around the world, currently 3.5 billion people in cities, projected to be 6.5 billion by 2050. It's a huge growth. It's equal to adding an urban area the size of Manhattan every day, to give it some scale. So that's a lot of buildings that exist today. That's a lot of buildings that are going to be in the future. They're going to be a key part of the solution. And it's about how we make those buildings as efficient as possible, but also a lot smarter in the way they operate and contribute. So hope you give you some insights to that today. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. You know, I think it's probably a good idea to start with some clarifying questions. I would love to hear how you define energy efficiency and demand response, and talk a little bit about how they work together in the marketplace. So, you know, I don't know, Dan, do you want to take a stab at that first? Maybe Scott can provide some comments as well.
I'll just answer that very generally and then let my colleagues talk more specifically. But I see my friend from Ukraine over there who's already heard me talk once. And in my last talk, I remembered to bring a light bulb with me. And that was my prop. And I used it to talk about energy efficiency, which for a very long time has been trying to put less power into a device or an appliance and get the same benefit out with light. And so that's the very first thing that everyone should do. My colleagues here are among the world's leading experts in doing that. Demand response, you should think of it more as dynamic efficiency. It's using two-way communications and controls and price signals so that you give incentives to customers to use electricity different and at different times. And I'd be happy to talk later about what the environmental benefits are from doing that.
From a demand response perspective, we start, and how it's related to energy efficiency, we see that energy efficiency is really being able to reduce that base load of energy consumption within a building, first of all. And then, because the way we use buildings in society, we have the daylight peak and nighttime peak, I should say, at the end of the afternoon, where everyone comes home from school, from work, and puts the lights and everything on, we get this big peak. That happens also in the morning when we wake up. So there's not this constant demand of electricity. It goes up and down during the day, and our systems, our electrical infrastructure needs to cope with that. Now, if we build that to cope with the biggest peak, we're going to be spending huge amounts of capital just to cope with those peaks that happen at very short periods of time and not every day. But if we have tools that help transmission system operators, distribution system operators, to be able to just bring those peaks down or move those peaks just for those short periods of time, we can save a huge amount of capital investment. So demand response is a great tool to do that on top of making your buildings more efficient. So Honeywell has a technology, automated demand response, or ADR, and that enables us to enable buildings to participate in a collective way, being able to reduce their electricity at times of peak demand and shift that and help towards energy security, avoiding blackouts that peak demands on the grid can cause.
Maybe now that is a good lead-in for me to just make this very simple comment. As Scott explained, the peak demand goes up and down, and it's the job of the electric utility or whoever the power producers are to meet that demand. So if you're in a control room and you see the demand going up on your system, you have to bring additional power plants online. And that is done by way of economics. You put the cheapest one on first because it's the lowest cost electricity. And then as demand goes up, you call into service another power plant. But with each new power plant, it's more costly, and from a climate change standpoint, it's dirtier. The emissions are higher. So there actually is an emission savings as well as a cost savings from trying to shift that demand around. And instead of going to a power plant, going to your homes and businesses and turning you into a virtual power plant.
Thank you. You know, maybe just to wrap this clarification portion off, you know, Clay, when we were prepping for this, you kind of very succinctly, in a few words, kind of put it in a simple way for me. So do you mind sharing that with everybody? And then I also wanted you to touch on this too. Another term we hear often, and it was mentioned in the opening, is the term smart grid. I mean, how does that fit in with demand response and energy efficiency?
We'll see if it's simple. So one way to think about this is energy efficiency, and it's been mentioned, essentially reduces energy demand across an entire day, okay? So you might think of it sort of like a base load plant, like nuclear tends to be base load. Coal generation is often base load. They run pretty much 24/7. If I insulate a building, my energy use will go down in the winter, it'll go down in the summer, okay? If I change the lighting, then the savings are time dependent, okay? When the sun's out, I don't have to, I don't save quite as much as when it gets dark. When the days are shorter, it saves more energy. Demand response essentially allows us to shape that energy reduction over time. So when the grid most needs it, such as at the end of the day, when everyone comes home, turns on their air conditioners, in the future plugs in their electric vehicles, there's going to be a very large spike in electricity use. You can use demand response to, in some cases, pre-cool your building, right? Maybe even before you're there. Hour before you get home, you start cooling the building such that the temperature will float through. A lot cheaper to pre-cool the building an hour before than later. Demand response can also respond to other elements, such as intermittent renewables. The wind doesn't blow all the time. It's not sunny all the time. Every once in a while the clouds come out, the power of solar power goes up and down. Wind goes up and down. Demand response is a tool that can not just respond a couple days a year during the largest demand, but it can respond at different times of the day. And then the final level is really demand response, or reducing energy at very short time intervals can be used to stabilize the grid. Wind coming on, electric vehicles plugging in, unplugging can change the voltage and the current on the grid. Today you have power plants that are spinning, called spinning reserves, just there to be turned on, turned off to provide stability to the grid. You can do the same thing with demand response in buildings, and that's where energy storage really comes into play. What we'd love to be able to do is store that excess energy from the wind turbines, from the solar, put it in batteries, and be able to provide a continuous demand at the lowest cost. Now, storage is not new. For decades, we've been making ice at night, melting it during the day to air condition buildings. In fact, thousands of years ago, we built buildings that were more passive. They had thick masonry walls, they had overhangs, they cooled down at night and kept them from getting so hot in the day. So part of this is back to the future. Roger could tell you the most energy efficient buildings today look a lot more like buildings 500 years ago, actually, than the glass skyscrapers that we're building today. So efficiency is a tool that can adjust demand all the time or at particular times of the day, and that's both economic and good for the planet.
Okay, but so what you described, is that the smart grid? I mean, who wants to talk about the smart grid? Who wants to talk a little bit about the smart grid?
Well, I guess building upon what I've already said, the grid that we have in the U.S., and I think most of us, oh no, I forgot where Scott's from. I was going to say most of us are talking about the system in the U.S. But in the U.S., we have a saying that if Thomas Edison were to come alive again and take a look at the electricity grid, he would recognize everything that he saw. Because for most of the 20th century, the electricity grid was simply a matter of building transmission lines and building power plants and letting the demand go up and so on and so forth. So now what we're talking about is putting new technologies like storage, like demand response, like microgrids, so that we have a more distributed resource-based grid. So you've got more smaller microgrids, you're using demand response, and in the US, some would even say the days of the large power plant are over. But now to say it another way, think of the grid as a factory that has not been modernized or had any new information, control, sensory technology put into it. That wouldn't be a very efficient factory, it wouldn't be a very competitive factory. And so by putting that type of technology in, so that you can optimize and control and balance things at all times, that's what the smart grid is all about.
Thank you, and I appreciate you taking some time to explore that with me, because we gloss over it often, and there are terms that, are not well understood. I want to talk a little bit about, kind of getting to the next level with the smart grid, with energy efficiency and demand response. I mean, what are the drivers? We have both a European perspective and your global, in your focus, both companies here. Obviously, Green Building Council is, part of a global alliance. But, either from whatever both U.S. and other country perspectives you'd like to share, what are going to be the main drivers for deployment, both what's going on now and as you look into the future? And Scott, let's start with you, please.
Sure. So from a European perspective, though these challenges are happening elsewhere in the world, there's two key drivers that are causing massive change to the way we're having to use electricity and for it to be controlled and managed across Europe and specifically in the UK. The first of these is the fact that you've got legislation, climate change-based legislation, which is forcing old fossil fuel powered stations to be closed down. So in Europe, you've got the Large Combustion Plant Directive, which gives these polluting power stations a certain number of hours which they can have to run, then they've got to close down. So there's a program of those being closed down across Europe, when they're going to come offline. So in the meantime, what's replacing those? Well, the problem is that wholesale market electricity prices are very low at the moment. If you're looking to build a new power station, say a clean gas-fired power station, the economics just don't add up. And so the business case isn't there. So as a result, what we're getting is the number of power stations is coming down. The number of power stations that are replacing them aren't there. So most countries try and keep around a 15% headroom of electricity, so to allow for unforeseen events happening, say a power station not coming back online from maintenance or a breakdown in some of the transmission lines. So they keep about a 15% headroom. That's what most countries plan for. In the UK this winter, it's just over 1%, and next year it'll be minus 5%. So the national grid, the transmission system operator, when it goes negative, they have to implement emergency measures. So you can see now for the next couple of winters, the next couple of years, we're actually relying on those emergency measures. They're not for emergencies, they're just for normal operation. And we had, on November the 4th, the first time for nearly 5 years, one of those was implemented. But the issue there was that it was just a calm, cloudy day. It wasn't a cold day. And they had to call on that. So we're starting to find these issues. The other aspect is, okay, so what energy generation is being implemented? Well, renewables, and then the good news is that the cost of those is coming down. We're getting onshore wind and solar, being able to compete on a price basis without subsidies. Offshore wind will need needs support up into the 2020s, but that's coming down as well. The problem with solar and wind is that it relies on the vagaries of the weather as whether it actually generates or not. And so you get a lot of intermittency. And so that's a big challenge managing the grid as well, because you've got electricity supplying at some stage, and then as soon as the weather changes, it disappears off the grid. So there's tools that are needed to manage that. So those two key drivers that are now increasing are there. One is that we don't have the generation there, so supply-demand issues when demand exceeds supply. So we need something to be able to out there to either turn on excess generation or reduce demand. Equally, when renewable energy drops away, we either need more supply or reduce demand. And the final aspect is that day, the 4th of November, 2 days later, the winds came, and there was so much wind that the actual grid couldn't handle it, and they then had to pay wind farm operators over £1 million a day just to turn those turbines off. So actually having too much is a problem as well. And demand response can both turn demand down and turn demand up. So that's the management tool we're looking at. And of course, the way that demand response addresses those issues, it does it in a carbon-free way. It's a clean solution to that, as opposed to turning on an oil or a diesel-powered generator. So I hope that's clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. You know, I'd like to, we may come back to this topic, but I want to get Roger in the mix here. Can we talk a little bit about the trends in building efficiency? You mentioned a number of concepts and innovations in your opening comments. You know, how people really can impact efficiency. I mean, is that a new trend? And you know, are there other trends that we should be aware of?
Well, it may not be a new trend that people can affect energy efficiency, but it sadly is a new trend that people are beginning to positively affect energy efficiency. One of the things that has been a real issue for so long is that spectacular technologies have been developed by folks on this panel and others, and buildings have been built where designing in energy efficiency technologies has actually been, in some cases, 70% of the energy efficiency has come from these designed-in technologies. But of those 70% of these investments, almost 2/3 of those don't function at all if they're not properly operated by the occupants of the building. So we had this big gap between the promise of green buildings and the performance of green buildings. And what we're seeing with this new sensitivity to how to motivate human beings, for example, Mr. Delury was pointing out about how with appropriate demand response incentives, the occupants of the building can, in effect, turn the building into a power plant. In every way, when you stop using energy at the same level, that's the same as turning on another power plant. In any sort of traditional sense, you're actually getting new energy. So the fact that there is a recognition, new technologies like the Nest, or at the U.S. Green Building Council, the LEED dynamic plaque that tells you in real time how your building is performing and in simple, very simple ways, offers you diagnostic data about how to make your building more efficient. These are trends that are turning, in effect, a period in which the human dynamic was not being properly factored into the equation, and one to where human psychology and human behavior is actually being recognized both by technologies that properly motivate and incent the occupants to take action, but also situations where, for example, technologies like electrochromic glass or other technologies that literally are kind of integrating into the fabric of the building the capacity to have the building change its level of opacity during the day in a way that takes account of the fact that sadly human beings don't appropriately bring the shades down and take these other steps. So we're seeing a very positive trend toward recognizing the role that human beings can play, being more ambitious about that, but also making sure that our new level of technologies take into account some of the limits of prior technologies. You were just pointing out about the intermittencies, but then Clay was talking about spectacular new battery storage opportunities. So again, some of the limits both of human potential and capacity, but also limits of the still small percentage of energy that comes from renewable sources are being recognized. And so I think it's very, very exciting. I think for a long time the UN recognized that buildings efficiency was the largest sort of potential category for reducing carbon emissions in a way that actually was cost negative, meaning you can, I guess counterintuitively, you can make money doing it. So it was a very positive area, but everybody knows that while energy efficiency has been the so-called low-hanging fruit, there's a reason why that low-hanging fruit has been hanging for so long and is even rotting a little on the ground. And I think some of what we're talking about now is how to really accelerate that potential and meet the opportunity that energy efficiency has always promised, but not completely presented.
I mean, there are a couple things that you mentioned, and maybe, Clay, you can speak. I'll take one at a time because others might want to talk about this first topic, storage. Several of you mentioned storage in some form or fashion. Maybe, Clay, can you talk a little bit about how storage fits in with demand response and energy efficiency?
Sure. I think I addressed it a little bit, but you know, obviously, if you have the ability at a reasonable time scale to charge up a very large battery, and these batteries can be quite large. They can essentially megawatt hour type capacity. I mean, picture an ISO container filled with lithium-ion cells. That's sort of the modulus of these type of systems. So you can park them on a college campus. You can put them as part of a microgrid serving a large installation. You know, charging, discharging in the morning when energy is cheap and using it for a couple hours in the afternoon. That would reduce the overall demand. Conversely, you can also charge and discharge on a 3-second basis and use it to help regulate the grid itself. Here's an interesting thought exercise. There's something that you could do today with a traditional plug-in electric vehicle. Everyone talks about vehicle to grid and this idea that the lithium-ion battery in your car is going to charge and discharge, and it's going to be transacting, and it's going to be making money and bidding itself into the energy markets. Well, a very useful thing would be when you go home and plug your electric vehicle into the charging station, if that charging station was connected to the internet, and that internet was connected to the wind farm that was generating the energy, and if your car only charged when there was an excess of wind on the grid, and when there wasn't an excess of the wind died down, it stopped charging, over the course of a night, you'd wake up and your vehicle would be full. The value of those services to that wind farm in aggregate across all those electric vehicles would be phenomenal. And it wouldn't require a redesign of your car. It wouldn't require putting an inverter in your car to put the AC current back on the grid. It's a very simple example of what could be done today. There are similar examples in your home. If you are heating up your water using electricity, using a heat pump, I hope, because it's the most efficient way to do it, if, again, you're connected through the grid over the internet, you should be able to only heat up the water when there's excess wind on the grid. Those are examples of storage that are much simpler than I think people think of with very sophisticated storage type systems.
Let me say a word about storage, combining it with an explanation of a word that Clay just used and one that I used originally, and that is microgrids, or as they're called in other parts of the world, particularly Africa, mini-grids. And let me give you an example. So we have a utility in San Diego, California, San Diego Gas and Electric, very large service territory, but much of it in the desert, all the way out to Arizona. And so there is a city out far into the desert, which is growing rapidly as a vacation town, and it is served by one old transmission line. And they often refer to it as an extension cord that goes out over a mountain and down to this town of Borrego Springs. And it keeps breaking. And so they obviously had to do something. So instead of doing a new transmission line, they decided to make the town of Borrego Springs into its own microgrid. They put in storage, They put in a solar generating facility. They did demand response. They took an approach to go into all of the buildings and homes and make them as energy efficient as possible. And so they now, sort of the same way that I talked about making the big grid, they have a microgrid which can balance itself and doesn't rely on that extension cord coming over the mountain. Just quickly, another example. In our superstorm Sandy that ravaged New York City and New Jersey and so on, there were two universities where the lights stayed on. And these were universities that had a microgrid, where they could island themselves, as this new word is being used, away from the grid and still operate as an independent entity. And here is my quick plug for adaptation and resiliency. Instead of having large power plants and these long transmission lines, the idea of a smart grid, and in particular microgrid, means you've got a much more flexible, diverse, and resilient electricity grid.
Let's go back to something that Roger was talking about, and this idea of behavioral economics, or how human behavior can be tapped to drive more energy efficiency or demand response. Do you want to comment on that, Clay?
I think Roger was exactly right about the behavior side, and it doesn't happen very often, so I wanted to pile on. Great story, actually. It's about 10-year-old story. There's a very, very large, two varies, college campus in the United States, very geographically dispersed. Half of the campus is on the north side, half is on the south side, divided by a river. And the way they operated that campus is they had two building operators. One was responsible for all the buildings on the north side, one was responsible for all the buildings on the south side. There were two identical dormitories, built at exactly the same time, by the same contractor, to the same specifications, the same equipment, the same controls. When they were doing an energy survey of the college campus, they found that the energy use in those buildings was 20% different. And they couldn't figure out any logical reason for it. The same equipment, the same climate, the same systems, what was going on? They went and did an audit of both buildings, and they didn't find any appreciable differences in the buildings. So they did an experiment. They switched operators. The operator from the north went to the south. Guess what happened after a couple months? You know what happened. The other building was now 20% more efficient than the one. It was totally dependent on the operator. I hate to say this, being a technology company, but people run buildings, not computers. Computers can help people run buildings. We need to provide the interfaces. But we need people with the right training, the right motivation, the right information to be able to take advantage of all the technology that we're putting in the buildings. And I think that's an interesting metaphor. Sometimes we will hear from people, ooh, it's getting way too complex. People really can't run these buildings. Well, my car has 75 microprocessors in it. There's a bit serial link between the door lock and the CAN bus and the body controller in the car, but my mother, who's 84 years old, can drive it just fine. That's because when she pushes on the gas pedal, she doesn't know that she's pushing on a potentiometer going to a computer. When she turns the wheel, she doesn't know she's turning a potentiometer with a digital signal. And our challenge is to apply technology in ways that takes the burden away from people and makes them more effective. Behavior is critical. Someone running a full campus worth of buildings, and actually just tenants in buildings having the information they need to be able to optimize their local environment. We're having fun at the Empire State Building. We created sort of a game interface, a portal that allows an individual tenant to compare their energy use with other tenants in the 102-story Empire State Building. It's amazing in that being able to compare yourself with similar tenants and a little pizza and a little beer at stake allows them to challenge each other, to take extra effort, to track and report, set goals. That's very powerful. We're finding a significant amount of savings just by providing tools like that to the people that actually work in the buildings.
Let me follow up on that by pointing out that while it's interesting and it's always exciting to hear about one building in one city, the Empire State Building, it's also interesting to see how some of these same strategies can be scaled in an extraordinary way. So for example, even this wonderful game that Clay's talking about is built in to this LEED dynamic plaque, this tool that lets you see how well buildings are performing in real time. So for example, we're finding that of the 800 buildings that are providing data of the kind that the plaque provides, we're hearing again and again that in large campuses, in places where they're talking about 7 or 8 buildings, it correlates, the performance correlates very strongly to who's a good operator, which is to reinforce Clay's point that again and again, the higher quality operators are performing a lot better. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to recognize not just individual buildings that are performing well, but whole microgrids for campuses. So one of the campuses, it's not the same campus, I don't think, as the one with this great story, but the campus in University of Texas at Austin is the first of what is, we hope, is going to be just an extraordinary series of grids that will be certified to what's called the peer rating system that will now be the certifiers to. And this first one at the University of Texas at Austin, just to give you a sense of how staggeringly impressive this system is, and Johnson Controls was a player in making this happen, is that you literally, if you put your computer into the plug here at the U.S. Center, or you do it in most offices, you're getting 30–40% efficiency from the time the energy is being produced to the time it's coming into your computer. But at the University of Texas at Austin, there's an 87% efficiency just in the production of the energy to its ultimate powering up of electronics. And that is extraordinary. And that's something that we'll be recognizing moving forward at the U.S. Green Building Council.
Yeah. Scott, would you like to hop in?
Sure. And I mean, one of the aspects we find with buildings is obviously energy efficiency is going to make them operate in a far better and sustainable way. But a lot of them aren't very efficient, and also bringing in the human behavioral aspects means they're not operated very efficiently, as we've heard. But if we can make buildings more intelligent and smarter, we start taking away some of that human error aspects of it. And that's a key theme that Honeywell and our peer competitors also are driving to do. And I mean, we launched recently the Honeywell Smart Building Score that enables you to assess just how smart your building is. We launched that in India and then across 7 cities in the US, and the results were that there was a lot of improvement that needed to be done, which is good from us because there's a lot of potential out there to improve the smart way that buildings can operate. Another aspect around is the way you use energy in a smart way. And I think what we're seeing now when we bring in the demand response aspects of it is that you look, there's a sort of 3-way approach now. There used to be 2 ways. So one is use less energy, so make your building as energy efficient as possible. Buy your energy at the lowest price, so it costs you the minimum amount. And now it's when you use electricity as well, because when demand peaks, the price peaks with it. So if you can shift when you use electricity from a time of high price to a period of low price, you can save a lot of money. So there's a third aspect to it. So now there's this smart approach to being able to use energy in your building. So that time aspect is a new key element. And demand response technologies enable buildings to do that. And Honeywell has sort of, an automated solution for doing that again, which enables buildings to decide when they participate in demand response events and then participate in an automated fashion. And we've got now over 1.4 million buildings around the world participating in that. So this isn't an R&D project. This is proven. It's working right across the US. The US is well established, but also rolling out across India, China, the first systems in the UK, and building around those. So this is all new stuff, but it's happening and it's accelerating. As we said before, you see the drivers that are forcing these sort of technologies to be implemented to solve problems, and buildings to benefit from their participation. Now, the final thing I wanted to say is that there's been a bit of negative press around demand response recently. So they're saying the issues we're having with not having enough, potential for blackouts, that's because we don't have enough generation. So it's ignoring the fact that we can also modulate the demand side. There's also then, but on the demand side, that's forcing workers to put their tools down. No one's forcing organizations to do that at all. They have a choice. They have a choice to participate. They choose when they participate in these events and then enable that in a seamless way to shift that to a period without impacting the performance of the building or the comfort conditions for the occupants. That's what the technology enables them to do. So what we're seeing is buildings being a lot smarter these days, a lot more intelligent, and being able to benefit and being able to solve the problems we see on the grid.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about technology and new technologies and how technologies are being integrated, and how we're experiencing the benefits of the sophistication when we bring them together, when we bring efficiency and demand response together with buildings and with microgrids, and that's very exciting. But what about finance? I mean, are there new innovations that can help address how we pay for and finance these types of investments? I know energy service companies and performance contracting is one vehicle to do that, but maybe there are others. Can I hear from a few of you on those topics, please?
Okay. Let me just note that among the ever-growing collection of rating systems that we're administering at the U.S. Green Building Council, there's one that actually is used by major investors throughout the world to determine whether whole portfolios of buildings they're working on or major, at least partly privatized infrastructure, how that infrastructure is performing and whether it's performing at a high level of energy efficiency, among other factors. And what we're finding is there is an extraordinary growth in the sophistication of investors simply asking the question, and lenders simply asking the question amid the other questions that a would-be borrower will be very motivated to answer affirmatively. What are you doing to make your infrastructure more sustainable? What are you doing to make your buildings more sustainable? And the result is we're noticing a tremendous additional motivation on the part of major developers, public and private sector, to build in and then communicate in a more accountable way how their buildings and how their infrastructure and grids are performing. So one of the things that I think is very powerful and positive is the degree to which large pension funds, large funds that are administered by whole countries, that they're showing that their commitment to climate change reduction or carbon reduction is reflected in a very practical way in making sure that the people to whom they're lending money or they're investing, whose projects they're investing in, are going to be able to report to them about the performance of those assets along sustainability and energy efficiency lines.
I'll just quickly come at this from a different angle. In making a grid smart, you have to do some things on the customer side of the meter that we've begun to talk about here, but you also have to do things on the utility side of the meter. Utilities are not going away, at least in terms of being a wires company. They may get smaller, but we're still talking about utility infrastructure in many ways. And so utility infrastructure, just as with roads and bridges, needs investment. But when you come to utilities, at least in the US, many of them are regulated, and they can't just spend money on their own when they think they've got a good idea. They have to get approval from their regulators to raise their rates, and so that's part of the financial aspect in the US anyway of making the grid smart.
Just one quick comment on ESCOs was brought up, energy service companies, and they often use a procurement model called performance contracting, where essentially the energy savings over time pays for the capital improvement, as well as any financing costs for borrowing the money, as well as the commissioning, the measurement, and verification of the savings. The ESCO guarantees the savings over the term of the contract, and the advantage is, particularly for public entities, is that it converts energy waste, which is excessive bills to utilities, into infrastructure investments. So you're recycling the waste to make the improvements. What we've seen over the last 30 years or so of the ESCO business in the U.S. is it was initially focused purely on energy efficiency, and I'm not sure what Honeywell's experience is, but I believe most of the ESCOs see similar market trends. About a third of our projects include renewable energy. And an increasing number of those projects are including elements of a microgrid, distributed generation, starting to apply energy storage. And the reason is very simple. It is generally always cheaper to save a watt than to generate one. And even though the cost of solar energy has decreased, the cost of distributed generation, other forms there, what our clients, and particularly public sector clients, are seeing is that they get a lot more out of the distributed generation investments they would make if they first make the buildings more efficient. So we're seeing a trend towards more and more integrated projects, really looking at energy systems as a whole, which reduces their costs. By the way, that's exactly the best way to minimize the environmental impact of those projects as well, the most carbon out at the lowest cost. And I think financing is a very key element of being able to increase penetration of the great technologies we were just talking about.
I just want to talk about, on the financing side, the benefits that we're finding with clients with demand response, in that if you take the large utilities, the transmission system operators who want those resources, they want them in large blocks. So lots of buildings can offer hundreds of kilowatts here. They're too small. So you need service providers, demand response aggregators, who bring all of those kilowatts together and into large blocks of electricity and can offer that over to the transmission operators in the blocks they need. So that's a practical way for them to use it. These demand response aggregators, I mean, they use technologies that we offer, such as the Honeywell ADR solution, to do that. And then those transmission system operators, they pay for that. So what the aggregators do is they will actually, to connect a building for it to participate, they'll pay for the kit, the equipment to connect them up. And they will, so the building operator will get their building connected up at no cost. When their building is called on to reduce electricity, it will be done in a way that no one notices. And then they get a pot of cash on the desk every quarter. So the aggregators love having those conversations with customers. We're going to come in to put a pot of cash on your desk. What do you want to use it for? So this isn't reduced tariffs or anything. This is money. So what we're finding, what are those customers using that cash for? If you like, free cash. So some are putting it into energy efficiency measures to pay for those, improve the business case on renewable energy projects that may have longer paybacks to make those pass the criteria. One of our customers, they're putting it into a community energy fund and putting that to fund good news projects out in the community and support those. So, this is it's a new technology in Europe anyway, but it's generating money that can be used in innovative ways to do lots of really good things.
That's really exciting to hear about how you can reinvest. And once our experience, once you get started on these kinds of initiatives, your appetite for them grow. You find they're easier to do than you thought, they're less expensive, and you just want to do more. So what I'd like to do, we have a few minutes left, and just see if there are any questions from the audience. If there are, I see at least one. I'd like to take a few. I see three. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all three because we don't have very much time left, and then we will efficiently respond and close. So please. Thank you. And please introduce yourself when you ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Very, very interesting presentations. Daniela Ruff, Renewable Energy Specialist with Golder Associates. My question is regarding large-scale utility grid regulation with renewable power to gas. I know it's kind of a new concept. It's now being implemented in Germany, where they're basically converting excess renewable energy when you would be paying a generator to curtail, basically using that to generate hydrogen, which you can inject into the natural gas network up to 10% or so, and then maybe taking a step further with carbon sequestration, mixing it with hydrogen, the carbon dioxide to form carbon neutral methane that can also be injected in the gas network. I'd like to hear your thoughts in terms of this large-scale, long-term potential energy storage technology and how it might be applied in the U.S.
Do you want to do all three?
We are, because I don't think we'll have time.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. My name is Ryan Cunningham, and I'm with Fenton Communications in Washington, D.C. And I was wondering what each of you thought about both the U.S. and European regulatory environment, particularly in the U.S., different RTOs, and how much of a barrier or whether there are opportunities with that regulatory structure to help implement smart grids and demand response and storage.
My name is Kirill Tamlyak. I come from Kiev, Ukraine. The question is about the smart grids and then demand response. One of you has mentioned that the projects should be of an appropriate size to start deal with this, sell it and then buy it. What is the size about, let's say in terms of kilowatt hours or something like this?
Why don't we start with that one first and maybe move our way backwards? So we only have a few minutes. I'm going to ask you to keep they're very good questions, and they are a bit complex. So we'll get as far as we can get up here, and then maybe we can continue it when this closes. So,
Okay,
Dan,
so the
go
answer
quick.
to your question is it can be a house or a building, or as was mentioned, you can put those together and have a company put control devices into 1,000 buildings and then operate it as if it were a virtual power plant. The answer to your question is that the reason I'm here is that climate change policy is made by environmental regulators, environmental policymakers. Many of them only think in terms of the efficiency that we've all known about for a long time, or renewable energy. Well, there's a new kid in town, and it's called smart grid and demand response and some of these other things that we've talked about. And there are environmental benefits. They can help with climate change and don't take them off the table. To your question, I've heard of that, but I'm not familiar enough to be able to talk about it.
So talking about the size of the building, quite right. In the US, there's a lot of residential demand response programs, but that's because primarily they use HVAC in the homes, electricity use, whereas electricity use or heating in European is more from either gas or district heating, so it's a bit different for electricity. So when you're looking at demand response growing across Europe, it's going to be primarily around commercial industrial buildings that are looking at. So then for the aggregators, there definitely is, for their business model, that they go by euros per kilowatt of what they can get in their business model. So it tends to be the larger buildings, because the equipment that we install, it costs about the same to put it in a small building as it does in a large building. So you want to go after the larger buildings. So it tends to be medium-sized commercial and larger than that. So we're not looking at small, medium enterprises. Okay. Looking at legislation, the main barrier in Europe is that enables the demand side to participate is making supply, so generation and demand side compete on an equal basis. And that doesn't occur right across Europe. And that's because the way that the whole infrastructure has developed, like Thomas Edison would have seen, as we saw, is the fact that it was all supply side. And the demand side, the regulation's all built around that. So some countries are now starting to do that and roll it out. And there is EU legislation driving that. So you've got the UK and Ireland. France, this year, put their systems in place. Belgium is in there, Finland, Switzerland, Austria. The others are starting to catch up, which leads over to the other question, and things around, like in Germany. I mean, a lot of those technologies are quite exciting and they're good. A lot of them require subsidies to support them, to get them off the ground. One of the issues you have in Germany is you have a lot of really good approaches on that side. You don't have any on the demand side because there are no subsidies on the demand side. So there's this supply-demand side imbalance in Germany, which needs to be smoothed out before that side's going to be taken off. So in Germany, there's a huge amount on the supply side of renewables and bio and all those are great. Nothing on the demand side because they just financially can't compete at the moment. So you either take those tariffs away on the supply side or you put them on the demand side to balance up.
Sorry, very aware that we've only got 10 seconds, probably less than that. That I just want to emphasize that while there may be a subsidy gap in Germany for the supply side issue, but those are not scalable concepts. There's not going to be subsidies in the vast majority of countries we're talking about. And so the kind of creative free market-based solutions that Johnson Controls has come up with, that Honeywell is coming up with, industry may have created a lot of the problems associated with climate change, but they are the only strategy for scaling something quickly, sending that price signal that you can make money and you can reduce carbon emissions. So I just want to end my comments on just emphasizing that market-based strategies are, frankly, maybe in a perfect world, maybe they wouldn't be the only solution, but at this point, for scaling, we need something where people can make money, where the price signals they do send in Germany, but which they definitely don't send in most other countries, can be overcome by the signal created by the message, you can make money creating buildings and grids that actually also reduce carbon emissions.
I love your question about hydrogen, and I'm not going to comment on hydrogen per se, but just the idea of taking a systems approach to our energy systems. Lot of things have to be lined up in order for that to work, economics and that. But there are Caribbean islands that have an excess of wind and solar, and they have way too much power during the day and not enough at night. And what they're doing is they're using their desalination plants for storage. I know of some Scandinavian countries which have seasonal storage. They use excess wind and power to dry the wood chips and store them so they can burn them in the winter when they need heating. Storage is, we think lithium-ion batteries, but storage is a system thought. And the more we interact and couple our energy systems, the more we can provide the best environmental benefits at the lowest cost. So that's a great example of a number of things we should be thinking about.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really good way to wrap up this session, because I think what the evolution is, when I ask about what the trends are, you've all talked in different forms or fashions about the integration of technologies and a system approach, and then regulation ultimately following that pattern, valuing a system approach, letting the system be developed in an economic way to solve whatever the objective is. And I think when we're here at the COP, there are these nationally determined commitments that are being contemplated by 194 plus governments. Many of them have elements of demand response, smart grid, and energy efficiency, as well as renewable energy and natural gas and combined heat and power. I mean, we can just go down the list of technologies. And what I guess maybe a message to them is, number one, implement those, but think about it as a system, not even as just energy efficiency versus renewables versus any other technology, but look at it all together in an integrated and system way. So I want to thank all of you, and I'd like to thank the panelists. Really excellent discussion. And of course, thank the U.S. Center. Have a great day.